What is the scariest story you know to be completely true? Story 1. My cousin picked up a hitchhiker about 20 years ago. Nice enough guy. Cousin was hungry, so stopped at McDonald's. Grabbed the hitchhiker some breakfast. 2. Dropped him off where the guy had said he was headed. No big deal. Next morning, my cousin's watching the morning news and sees that hitchhiker's face. Dude was a serial killer and had killed someone but picked him up. Cousin calls the cops and they have him come in. Turns out the hitcher had killed the very next person after my cousin that had given him a ride. He'd killed a few people that had given him rides. That was his mo. They asked the hitcher why he didn't kill my cousin. He said, I'd planned to, but he was a really nice young man. He bought me breakfast. I couldn't kill someone that bought me breakfast. Story 2. When I was a kid, there was a peeping Tom in the neighborhood. But the weird part is we all knew who he was. A little older guy named Ralph, who lived a couple streets over and smoked like a chimney. We knew because he was caught once early on by a neighbor while on their roof. Watching them through the skylight, the neighbor had left a ladder against the house when doing work earlier that day. But after that he was like a ghost, impossible to catch. People would find footprints and cigarette butts outside windows, smell cigarette smoke, and occasionally see the red cherry on the cigarette glow in the woods. Occasionally angry dads and teenagers who spotted him out in the darkness would give chase. But he moved like a deer through the woods and no one could put hands on him. The cops were involved a few times and they dragged him in, but it was never for long, partially I think, because he had a disabled wife for whom he was the sole carer. He was sorta a neighborhood boogeyman, though thankfully seemed mostly harmless, if terribly creepy. Many years later, there were a rash of break-ins around the neighborhood. People even joked at the time that it must not be Ralph, because we all figured he had copies of everyone's hider keys already if he wanted to go inside. City note. We later learned that he definitely did have keys to some houses. Anyway, everyone's guard was up. One night, one of the neighbors heard a commotion outside and ran outside to find a stranger laid out in his driveway, beat to shit. They called 911. And when the police arrived, they were able to identify the guy as someone who had previous arrests for B and E, and found items from the previous break-ins in his vehicle nearby, and later at his apartment. As for how he ended up taking a bloody nap in the driveway, he said he was jumped from behind in the dark, and never got a good look at the guy. All he remembered for certain was that the guy stunk of cigarette smoke. Edit, dang. A bunch of people are curious about the keys. Basically we learned that one of the times he was picked up, they'd found a ton of keys on a pegboard. He claimed he just collected keys he'd found, and they had no labeling, so there was no way to prove otherwise. So maybe he was just an avid key collector, but, come on. Story 3. My high school GF called late one night, after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details. So I told my parents and drove over towards her house. At the top of her subdivision, was met by a cop with lights on. He asked where I was going, and I told him about the call from my GF. He lets me go by, and I come over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lives, and I see multiple cop cars around the circle. They watch me pull up and get out of my car. My GF comes running out of her house and meets me in the street. She explains that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my GF's house, where she started banging furiously on the front door. My GF's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door and the neighbor just fell into the foyer, bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looks up to see the attacker headed up the walkway towards the front door. She pulls the neighbor into the house and closes the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the little window at the top of the door. Her mom started screaming and the attacker just turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night along with 2 or 3 cops outside in their cars. And in the morning, we could see blood still poured on the floor in the foyer, and splattered blood above the front door from where the attacker had swung the bloody tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was just completely random. The neighbor survived and to my knowledge had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. TLDR, a GFS neighbor, was brutally attacked in her home. She ran to my GFS house, and the attacker fled after nearly getting into their house too. No one was ever caught. Story 4. Close friend of the family, single young woman. Back in the 80s, bought her first house, small house in a quiet neighborhood, they all were in my town. So you know she's moving in her one small U-Haul worth of stuff. Nice summer day. Most neighbors see this and come up and introduce themselves. Anyway, as the story goes, it was warm, summer, no AC. You could get houses with no AC back then. So she has the windows all open to try and let some breeze through. Now it's night. She's absolutely exhausted from the move, so she walks into her back bedroom and flops on her bed. All the lights were on in the front living room kitchen part of the house, but she didn't turn them on in the bedroom. She said she was just gonna rest for a few minutes and get back to putting stuff away, but she fell asleep. She said she didn't know how long it was, but she woke up to a sound. And then she realized what it was once she got her bearings. Someone was slowly and trying to quietly cut the screen out of that window with a razor blade. After the fact, we assumed the idea was they would secretly enter the dark part of the house. Assuming she was still up in the lit part and lying wait for her, she sat up in the bed and yelled, "I have my Magnum right here next to me, and if you don't GTFO I'll shoot," or something to that effect. She said she heard the footfalls of whoever it was hauling us away, which was lucky for her, because she had no gun. She didn't even have phone service hooked up to the house yet. No cell phones in the 80s for most people. She had successfully bluffed her way out of God knows what. I've heard a lot of scary true stories in my life, but this one has stuck with me ever since I was a teenager. In that moment, she shot her shot and it worked. Story 5. This will be buried, and that's fine. When I graduated from college in early 90s, I got a job as a high school teacher. I made to 9K a year. I loved it, but I had to work a summer job to pay bills. During said summer job I broke up a fight between several teenagers. No big deal. Cops arrived. And one cop said to me, "Bro, why are you wasting your time teaching? You could work for us and make double with all the overtime," he said. "And it's not like you'll ever have to use your gun. And if you do, it won't be someone you know or care about." I had bills and debt. So 1 year later, I'm a young patrol officer. In my mind, it was a way for me to pay for grad school. Student loans of today didn't exist yet. So one day I get a call for backup, as a suspect wanted for a homicide had taken an immigrant family hostage. I race to get there. As I arrive at SKT tells me, "Come with me. We will take the backyard position in case he flees out the back." As we enter the yard, the suspect is running towards a fence. He turns, and like John Wick, he gets off several shots. He hits 2 officers, me included. I return fire, and hit him with all 4 shots I fire. And that was the day I killed my childhood best friend. We were best buddies in elementary school. He moved away, but we still got together every couple years. I hadn't seen him for 5 years prior to this incident, but every goddamn day of my life, I think of him and his warm smile. Every day. I'm sorry, Jose.